Greenland is a place that typically doesn't get a lot of attention. It's huge, bigger than France, Germany, Spain, the UK, and Italy combined. And it's home to only around 56,000 people, which by comparison is just slightly more than somewhere like Cornwall, Ontario. Not exactly a metropolis. On the surface, it doesn't look like much. Barren tundra, with the world's largest ice sheet outside of Antarctica. Yet despite its harshness, it has played an important role in the history of European settlement and exploration. Many are familiar with the stories of the settlement of Greenland by Eric the Red. But why is Greenland now inhabited by Inuit? What happened to the Norse? And why is it today a part of the Kingdom of Denmark? Now, despite being so far north and so inhospitable an environment, the human habitation of Greenland has a very ancient origin. The earliest settlements known in archaeology date back to around 2500 BC. The Independence I culture was perhaps the earliest. They were of Paleo-Inuit origins, part of a people who had migrated into North America from Siberia around 5000 BC, and were and are genetically similar to Northeast Asian groups, distinct from the earlier Paleo-Indians who spread through much of North and South America at least 10,000 years earlier. They established themselves in the far north, in the most severe region of Greenland, where summer is hardly above freezing, and winter days are an average of minus 30 degrees Celsius. Even now, people find such living conditions extreme. But these Paleo-Eskimos were surviving in this environment with no technology save stones and animal bones. They were living on muskox, winter fox, fish, ptarmigan, and they were dressing in muskox hides, living in sophisticated tents built from muskox hides centered around a hearth. There were almost no trees on Greenland then or now, and so there was very little wood. How they survived the high Arctic winters in small tents without dying from either cold or smoke inhalation speaks to their ingenuity. Likely they had a method of burning seal fat, which when controlled at the right temperature, has been shown to produce very little smoke. It's thought that if it was minus 30 outside, if the tent was made of a double layer of caribou or muskox hide, they could maintain a temperature of around +8 inside. What drove them to come to inhabit such a severe region was likely not choice. They had developed customs for survival over thousands of years in cold regions of Northeast Asia. Probably, they were initially forced into those regions through tribal conflicts for territory and resources, and adapted to that lifestyle over thousands of years. The populations of these groups would have been small, possibly even in the hundreds, and the lifestyle radically different from what most people can now imagine. Not all the Paleo-Inuit were content with staying in the most frigid regions of Greenland. The Sekak culture, established around 2400, likely represents people of the same ethnic origins who had migrated south to find a less harsh environment. The frozen remains of one of these people, dated to around 2000 BC, was DNA tested, and while it shows genetic proximity to modern Inuit populations, they were not actually the direct ancestors of the modern Kalaallit people. Instead, they were from the same branch as the Koryaks in modern Kamchatka, Russia. The Sekak dwelt in Greenland for over 1,000 years, living in small tents, hunting seals, small birds, and marine animals. However, around 800 BC, these people disappeared, possibly relocating or dying out. Shortly after this, the Dorset culture, a closely related Paleo-Inuit people, who may have had some direct genetic relation to the Sekak, and whose culture centered on the island of Dorset in what is now Canada, began to spread into Greenland. Their full range is somewhat disputed. There appear to be no direct genetic connections between the Dorset people and modern Inuit groups. Some people believe the onset of the medieval warm period disrupted their way of life, which involved hunting seals upon the ice. However, there are darker ideas about what might have become of them. Some researchers believe a new incoming group, known as the Thule people, exterminated the Dorset people, who entirely vanished, perhaps wiped out through conquest, by the ancestors of the modern Inuit. In either event, around 900 AD, Greenland was mostly, if not entirely, uninhabited. Around 500 kilometers east of Greenland rests the island of Iceland. It would be more apt to reverse the names, perhaps, for Iceland has a far milder temperature, and it's not covered in a sheet of ice. In fact, despite being so near Greenland, Iceland has a radically different climate, such that the average winter temperatures in Iceland are in fact warmer than Ottawa or Halifax, Canada. The Norse had established a settlement there at least by 874, although some evidence points to an even earlier period. It's largely from the Icelandic people that we have preserved today the amazing works of Old Norse mythology, most of which were written down by the Icelandic skalds. Within the culture of that rather secluded island nation, the language maintained such continuity that modern Icelandic people can still read and understand works written in Old Norse. Sometime around 960, Thorvald Asvaldsson was exiled from Norway for manslaughter. Taking his family and all the belongings that he could manage on a boat, he sailed west, making for their new home in Iceland. He died around 970, and his son Eric, better known as Eric the Red, would in 982 suffer the same fate as his father. After having a dispute with a neighboring farmer over the killing of his slaves, he was exiled from his homestead in Haukadale. From there he moved to the island of Broke and Oxney. He entrusted his Setstoker, a ritual family pillar, to Thorgest, likely a neighbor. But later, the man refused to return it. When Eric took it by force, Thorgest and his sons chased him down. Eric and his men gave battle, and 2 of Thorgest's sons were killed. The Thing sentenced Eric to 3 years exile for the incident, and he chose to sail west. Eric Thorvaldsson did not in fact discover Greenland. Its location had been known by people of Iceland for probably 100 years, and there were other earlier attempts to settle it. Gunnbjorn Ulfsson is the earliest known person to have seen Greenland. Eric sailed first to the east coastline covered in glacier, then journeyed south along the coast. He spent the winter in a place named Eriksay, meaning Eric's Island, in what would become the western settlement. In the spring he traveled up Eriksfjord and established a site of his home. He spent 3 years exploring the region to determine the best locations. The regions the Norse inhabited were milder than the northern regions of the island, with summer temperatures around 10 degrees, or in some places, in particular valleys, as much as 20 degrees, and winter temperatures averaging between -13 to -6, similar to some inhabited regions in Canada or Russia. Now, while the saga of Eric the Red jokes that he named the place Greenland in an attempt to market it and gain the ear of people looking to found a new settlement, the saga is recorded well after his death, and may be just a local joke. The fact is, Greenland was really much greener than it is today. But even today, the region which he settled is quite green during the summer months. The hills around the fjords are covered in thick grass, and at times there were likewise small patches of woodland, small birch and willow primarily. Though the naming may well have been a marketing gimmick, it wasn't a pure fabrication. Compared to the ice sheet that covers much of the landmass, the region which Eric settled was Greenland. Following his 3 years' exile, Eric returned from his exploration and managed to convince several hundred people to join him in the settlement of what he called the Greenland. 25 packed ships set out in the summer of 985, yet only 14 would reach their destination, with 11 lost to the sea and some others turning back. Perhaps all of history would have changed had Eric arrived with nearly twice the number that he did. Yet as it was, he still managed to achieve great success. They established 2 separate settlements. An east settlement near modern Qaqortoq had a population of around 5,000 at its height, with several communities, such as Herjolfsnes, mentioned in the sagas, where has been recovered some very well-preserved medieval Norse clothing. It was also here that Leif Erikson would obtain the ship that he used to sail to Canada. The settlement of Garðar was the location of the Althing, the local parliament, and the Christian bishopric. But there was likewise a west settlement near Nuuk, which is now the capital of Greenland, with a high of around 1,000 people. Though this population hardly can compare to the 40 to 60,000 people inhabiting Iceland during that time, it's nonetheless very significant given the harshness of the region and the technological limitations at the time. By numbers, the Norse settlers were the largest group that had ever dwelt in Greenland up to that time. The eastern settlement, which should really have been called the southern, was the larger and more successful of the two. When the first Norse settlers arrived, things went well. They brought sheep and cows with them, which flourished on the grassy hills. They managed to sow some barley, as well as turnips, beets, leeks, and cabbages, though they primarily focused on hay for livestock. They likewise collected and traded ivory tusks from walruses, and supplemented their diet through hunting and fishing. For the first 100 years of settlement, seafood made up only around 20% of the diet, as they were able to maintain enough cattle and crops to maintain their traditional Norse diet. One significant difficulty was the lack of wood. It was a scarce commodity. They began to build many of the structures with dry stone, insulating them with an exterior layer of turf, which provided excellent heat retention. Driftwood was the primary source of wood, and it had to be very carefully managed by the community. There was not enough that they could use it for firewood, but they did have another source, peat, which luckily Greenland has an abundance of. Back in 2017, there were international news stories about how there were wildfires burning in Greenland, because some of the peat had managed to catch fire in a dry spell. When Eric's son Leif reached manhood, he was sent back to Norway to act as a retainer for the King of Norway. He was waylaid by bad weather and had to put up for the winter in the Hebrides, at that point under Norse control. He had a son out of wedlock there, with Thorgunna, but Leif left her there and continued on to Norway. Thorgils would later be sent to live with his father in Greenland when he was old enough. While in Norway, Leif was converted to Christianity and instructed to spread the religion among the Greenlanders, and it's he who is primarily credited with spreading the religion to Greenland. Eric, however, resisted his son's preaching, but his wife did not, and helped build a church and refused any further marital relations with Eric, splitting the family and community apart. However, from the historical accounts, it's actually unclear if the entire community eventually became Christian or not. The most detailed account of the practices of an Old Norse volva or witch comes from Greenland, that of Thorbjorg, If you're interested, I covered this in detail in my documentary on the origins of witches. The account of exactly how the Greenlanders discovered North America is told differently in the different sagas. In the saga of Eric the Red, Leif discovered Vinland after being blown off course on his way from Norway to Greenland. This suggests he was carried across the Labrador Sea, which of course is entirely possible. However, the Greenland saga presents an alternative account. There, Vinland is said to have been first discovered by the explorations of Bjarni Hjartarson as early as 986. He was from Norway and sailed to Iceland to visit his parents, who had settled there. However, they had gone with Eric the Red to Greenland. Never having been to Greenland and without a compass or map, Bjarni tried to find it. He was blown off course and is reported to have seen land with low hills covered in trees. However, wishing only to locate the Greenland settlement, he did not go ashore here to explore, but doubled back and eventually found the eastern settlement of Eric, where he took up residence with his father in Hjartarlofsnes and told the story of the other land he had found. This accords with the fact that Leif journeyed to Hjartarlofsnes to acquire the ship to sail to Vinland. Likely he also acquired the details of the approximate location. Leif asked his father to come with him on the journey, but on the way to the ship, Eric's horse got a sprain, and he took it as a bad omen, choosing instead to stay behind. However, that winter, after the departure of Leif, the community was infected with the plague, and Eric, along with possibly a quarter of the settlers of Greenland, died. During his voyage to Canada, some of his crew were Christian while others were pagan. In fact, the saga records that the god the first Europeans to North America worshipped was Thor, who was asked to deliver them from starvation when they were stranded, and who provided them up with the frozen carcass of a whale. Leif succeeded in finding Vinland, now part of Canada, establishing a settlement and spending the winter, returning to Greenland with a load of wild grapes and timber. Timber probably being a key motivation for the exploration. Though Leif would never return to Vinland, others did, and it's believed that a small colony was established somewhere in Vinland, likely for the acquisition of timber and other goods for the settlement in Greenland. A lot of the Greenlanders' saga concerns these early ventures to North America, which were often bloody and traitorous. But this only covers later legends about the first early events. What happened to these first European settlers in North America 500 years before Columbus, I will cover in a future video. On a journey to Norway, made for the purpose of obtaining a bishop, Soki Thorisson was recorded as having brought a bear captured in Greenland as a gift to the king, Sigurd, also known as Sigurd the Crusader. This can only have been a polar bear, and apparently this wasn't the only time it was done, but was actually a regular form of trade. The king, perhaps pleased by the bear, agreed to the request and sought to have a bishop appointed to Greenland. In 1124, Arnaldur of Norway was appointed for the position. He arrived in Greenland in 1126 and construction began on the Cathedral of St. Nicholas, a suitable patron saint given the necessity of sea travel for the Greenlanders, but also likely connected to King Sigurd of Norway's crusader activities, which may have brought back the cult of St. Nicholas from what is now Turkey. In its present state, it doesn't look that grand, but during the 12th and 13th century, it had a bell tower, green glass windows, and was likely the wealthiest building in Greenland. That monumental building construction was taking place and the settlement was granted its own bishop points to a growing population and expanding wealth and power during the 12th and 13th century. While most of the Icelandic tales about Greenland involve murder, this should be considered selection bias. Tales are preserved and told that are interesting or salacious. Likely life in Greenland, while harder than Iceland, wasn't legally or morally much different. The settlement of Eric the Red at Brattahlid was said to have furnished the Logsogumadr, or lawman, who acted to recall the historical oral laws and administer the thing. Apart from live polar bears, they also exported walrus ivory, narwhal tusks, which they sold as unicorn horns, believed to have magical properties of healing, bear hides, seal skins, and blubber for oil, as well as wool. This trade was critical for Greenland, which required the importation of wood, grain, and iron, as no local sources of iron had become known. For this reason also, it's possible that more extensive travel and settlement was conducted into Canada than most people are aware of. From the sagas, we are told of several early trips, but these are recorded by the Icelanders concerning the early history of Greenland. There were likely many more than what we know. In the 12th and 13th century, as the Norse settlement in Greenland expanded, so too did another population. Known as the Thule people, the archaic Inuit spread from the area of Alaska eastward throughout the Arctic region using dog sleds, displacing and likely eradicating what may have remained of the Dorset people in the northwestern tip of Greenland. They began to establish themselves there in the late 13th century. While the sagas give clear accounts of various Norse interactions with native tribes in Canada, they don't provide any clear details about interactions with the Thule people within Greenland itself. Some archaeological evidence suggests that there were some Thule settlements near Norse settlements by the 14th century, but the nature of their relations in this early period remain unclear. However, they are the ancestors of the majority of the modern Greenlandic people. Despite their proximity to Iceland, it was to Norway that the Greenland settlers primarily looked. This would have been partly for historical family reasons, but also due to trade. Norway was the primary trading partner and connection to mainland Europe. Thus, in 1261, we have record that the Greenlanders willfully submitted to come under the Kingdom of Norway. This should have been a further sign of growth and importance of Greenland, but forces beyond human control would soon intervene. In 1349, the Black Death swept across Europe. We are not sure if it reached as far as Greenland. Possibly their isolation meant they were spared. However, they were nearly politically severed from Europe at this time due to the disorganization and decline that resulted from the catastrophe. In 1397, the Kingdom of Norway entered into a personal union with the Kingdom of Denmark, theoretically speaking, bringing the Greenlandic settlements into the sphere of the Kalmar Union, which sought to politically unite Scandinavian countries. However, in 1378, Alfur, Bishop of Greenland, died, and he was never functionally replaced. Various people were appointed to the role over the years, but none of them ever made the journey. Bjorn Einarsson, a trader and traveler from Iceland, arrived in Greenland in 1385 along with 4 ships and their crew, blown off course by a storm on his way from Norway to Iceland. He and his men ended up stuck there for 2 years. The locals made him a tax collector, and when he left, his ships were burdened with Greenland cargo, which he sold in Bergen, Norway, in 1388. This resulted in charges brought against him for unsanctioned trade. While he was there, he noted that the local cathedral was being administered only by a priest. As far as we know, beyond Bjorn Einarsson's misadventure, the last successful trip to the Greenland settlement by anyone in Europe for over 100 years was in 1406. A large part of the problem may have been the medieval cool period, sometimes known as the Little Ice Age. While dates for its onset vary, by 1300 it had become noticeably colder in Europe than the previous 2,000 years or more, and it would continue this way for several hundred years. The already harsh environment of Greenland became absolutely wretched. Glaciers expanded globally and of course in Greenland, and the buildup of Arctic ice made sailing extremely dangerous or even impossible. The hardship of this global cooling had a massive impact across northern Europe. Starting as early as 1300, warm summers were no longer guaranteed. Farming methods reliant on previous climate cycles were disrupted, and the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 was believed to have been caused by this climate shift. In 1303 and 1307, the Baltic Sea itself froze over. It became so cold. Ironically, because Greenlanders were already in a harsh environment, they may have been more resistant to small shifts in the beginning. However, over a long period, this would take a toll, leading to a dramatic decrease in the food production. This has been noted in archaeological studies. In the first few hundred years of the settlement, people primarily ate an agro-pastoral diet. However, towards the 1400s, it's thought that around 80% of the diet had shifted to marine animals and hunted animals. The increasing cold weather had forced them to shift their diet and to begin to eat as if they were Inuit. But it was worse than this. As mentioned, the Greenlanders had no known iron deposits and no lumber besides driftwood. When trade with Europe was dramatically reduced by a near impassable sea and shifting economic relations and trade politics, their access to iron or any other materials, even wood, was significantly reduced. To add to this, iron could not be resmelted or reforged because they had no access to coal or charcoal. This colony of Norsemen were, after nearly 500 years in Greenland, effectively thrown back into the Stone Age. Though some of the Greenlanders likely gave up and began trying to move back to Norway or Iceland, this does not appear to have been all, and darker things were at work than the climate. Church records from Europe give us a tiny window of the scale of decline of contact with the Greenland settlement. Almost all the church records that mention Greenland are connected with one thing: the tithe. This was basically a 10% tax that people had to pay to their local church, and the church was supposed to submit it to Rome. However, people in Greenland didn't have coinage to tithe, and so they paid in tusks and hides and so on. Pope Martin IV wrote to the Archbishop of Nidaros about this with some frustration in 1282. In 1325, the Archbishop and the Bishop of Bergen were discussing the tithe upon goods being imported from Greenland, and in 1341 there exists a record of Ivar Bardsson, a Norwegian priest, requesting a passport to travel to Greenland. Ivar's reasons for wishing to travel to Greenland are unclear, but it seems he was instructed to take over the management of the church affairs there after the bishop died, and a new one had not yet been appointed. Apparently, there was growing concern that the population of Greenland was reverting to paganism. Ivar recorded something of his travels, some of which still survive. He said that the old ways of travel to Greenland were now, as of 1341, blocked with ice, and that anyone who tried to sail the old paths risked their ships and their lives. He outlines a route to avoid the ice, but it involves sailing further west and possibly missing one's mark. The port, he says, has ice near it, and remarked that St. Olaf's servants shipwrecked there and drowned, for whom several stone crosses had been erected. However, he reports the villages in the western settlement as being fully inhabited. There were warm water springs, he reports, that people bathed in during the winter, generated from volcanic activity. people were hunting reindeer, and some also farmed reindeer for food, showing that they were adapting to local conditions. However, he recalls a darker account. From the eastern settlement to the western settlement, there are a dozen villages and all uninhabited. In the western settlement there is a large church, and it is called Steinsneskirkja. That church was for a while a cathedral and a bishop's seat. Now there are skrælings in all of the western settlement. There are plenty of horses, goats, oxen, and sheep, all raised by themselves, and no people, neither Christians nor pagans. All this was told to us by Ivar Barðason, a Greenlander, who was a steward of the bishop's chair in Garðr for many years, and he was one of those who were persuaded by a lawman to go to the west settlement in order to drive the skrælings out. And when they got there, they found no people, neither Christians nor pagans, except a lot of game and sheep, and they took from that money and sheep and as much as the ships could carry, and so they sailed home with it. Now, skræling is the name the Norse used for the Native Americans and Inuit. Ivar recorded an eastern Greenland settlement, which was still thriving, still full of people adapting and changing to the environment, hunting and raising reindeer rather than cattle, catching fish and seals. They were not starving, nor suffering greatly. They were under attack. The western settlements represented around 1/5 of the Norse population of Greenland, and the people there had all disappeared. They didn't migrate to Iceland or Norway. They didn't starve, leaving all their sheep and cattle behind. Likely they had tried to send word of the attack and requested aid from their brethren to the south. But by the time they could muster a force to reach them, the entire population of between 500 to 1,000 people had vanished into the abyss. In 1354, Magnus, king of Sweden and Norway, issued a command to one Paul Knutsson to undertake a mission to Greenland to help reestablish order there and to ensure the locals were not reverting back to paganism. Besides the order, we have no real details about the mission, unless it is what is recorded regarding Ivar. The last merchant ship arrived in Greenland in 1406, captained by Thorstein Olafsson. Like the other ships, carried off course and arrived in Greenland by mistake. But they stayed there for a few years, and he was married to Sigríður Bjarnsdóttir in the church at Valsey in 1408. They then returned to Iceland, where the detail appears in the Icelandic annals. Along with this is a shocking account. On the merchant ship was one Tolgrim Solveson and his wife Steinunn Ravnsdóttir. During their stay, Steinunn fell in love with a Greenlander named Kolgrim and left her husband for him. Thorgrim was furious and accused Kolgrim of being a sorcerer, using Galdr, magical chanting, in order to cast spells on Steinunn to make her fall in love with him. The Greenland Thing was convened, and 12 lawmen were assembled to judge the case. In accordance with Norwegian law, he was sentenced to death and burned on the stake. This dramatic incident is the last thing that we hear about the Norse of Greenland. The settlement was still functioning, could still gather the parliament in Garðr, operate a trial, and have 12 lawmen to judge. Perhaps paganism was on the rise in Greenland, but the Thing was clearly still Christian and condemned the man to death according to Norwegian law. It doesn't paint the picture of a community already falling apart, yet the Norse Greenlanders would never be seen again. In 1448, a letter from Pope Nicholas V to the Bishop of Garðr, lamenting that the tithe had not been received from Greenland in over 30 years. He says that he has heard that many of the people there had given up Christianity and that their settlements had been attacked by the heathens. He implores the bishop to re-establish connections with Greenland, but his letter would be ignored. By heathens, the Pope appears to be referring to the Inuit. Whether he is only referring to the account given by Ivar Barðsson from almost 100 years earlier, or if he had some new information that doesn't survive, we cannot know. But it is clear that word had spread that the Greenlanders were being attacked, such that even the Pope was to some degree aware of the situation despite its great distance and numerical insignificance in the scheme of the Catholic Church during the 15th century. In 1501, King Manuel I of Portugal sent a crew to Greenland to find a northwest passage to Asia. They tried to land in Greenland, but the sea ice was too great and they had to turn around. Instead, they ended up in Labrador and Newfoundland. In the 1540s, Icelandic sources record various parties landing in Greenland and attempting to make contact. The following was recorded from one of those searches. A dead man was lying face down on the ground. On his head was a hood well made, and otherwise good clothing of frieze cloth and sealskin. Near him was a sheath knife, bent and much worn and eaten away. In 1585, an English explorer, John Davis, stopped in Greenland while searching for the Northwest Passage. He encountered Inuit, but he didn't find any Norse settlers. Then, between 1605 and 1607, the Danish king Christian IV financed 3 expeditions to try to find the Norse Greenlanders, but nothing came of it. Finally, in 1711, the Norwegian Protestant cleric Hans Egede asked King Frederick IV of Denmark to fund an expedition to Greenland to restore contact with the Norse settlers, which he assumed were still there. They founded the Bergen Greenland Company to re-establish trade links. Hans found some of the ruins of the former Norse settlements, but the only people he found there were Inuit. So what did happen to the Norse settlers there? Some believe that the Greenlanders simply moved away, relocating to Iceland and Norway. However, if that had been, there would have been many Greenlanders and their descendants living in these places. Their stories would have become known, and there wouldn't have been a mystery that intrigued people for several hundred years, such that a lot of money and risks were taken to try to relocate these people. While the community may have gone into decline due to emigration, it seems unlikely that an organized abandonment was undertaken. A later Icelandic annal entry for 1342, though written in 1637, says, "The inhabitants of Greenland fell voluntarily from the true faith and the religion of the Christians, and having abandoned all good manners and true virtues, they turned to the peoples of America. Some are of the opinion that Greenland is quite close to the western regions of the world. This was the reason why the Christians began to refrain from the Greenlandic navigation." Now, it's been rightly noted that the use of the word America here is out of place, and could not have been from an original copied manuscript, because the name was not applied to North America in 1342. We don't know what his source for this was, but could there be any truth to it? Could it be that the Norse mixed with the Inuit and disappeared by being absorbed genetically? A genetic study in 2015 of Greenland Inuit found that 40% of the male Y haplogroups are of European origin. A more recent 2021 study analyzed the genetic components, estimating a 25% European admixture within the Greenlandic Inuit. However, there is no European female contribution in this. This supports the conclusion of recent studies, which believe that this genetic contribution is entirely recent and belongs to the pre-colonial and colonial period, which saw a new wave of Danish settlers and sailors taking Inuit wives. There was no mixing between the Inuit and the Old Norse Greenlanders. Likely struggling economically, cut off from European trade for over 100 years, the Norse Greenlanders' power significantly declined until at a certain point, the doom that fell upon the western settlements befell those of the eastern settlement as well. Perhaps they were not all killed in one swoop. It might have been a long process, but eventually, one by one, farm by farm, they were wiped out. This could have happened in 1411 or in 1450, but likely not much later than that. Possibly some small numbers were able to drag on even longer, but with dwindling numbers, they could no longer maintain churches or an agricultural lifestyle. They would have had to live like hunter-gatherers, but eventually they all died or were killed. Local Inuit legends say that there was a blood feud between the Norse chief Ungortak of Hlafse and a young Inuit warrior, Kaisape. In revenge for the Norse slaying of his younger brother, the Inuit warriors attacked from their ships, hiding behind icebergs to surprise the settlement. They burned the Norse inside their houses, but Ungortak and his family escaped, fleeing overland. The Inuit hunted them down, killing him and his entire family near Cape Farewell. While some have disputed the truth of this account, having found no archaeological evidence showing houses being burned, the fact remains that stories persisted over hundreds of years among the Inuit of how they had killed the Norse settlers. Though the Norse settlers were wiped out after almost 400 years of settlement, there was only about 300 years between another attempt to resettle the island. The Danish-Norwegian crown had never relinquished dominion over the territory, and though during the interlude between the extinction of the Norse settlers there, the Inuit became the sole population, there was no recognized legal change from the Danish side. Hans Egede, disappointed at the disappearance of the Norse Greenlanders, turned his attention to establishing a new Nordic colony there and converting the Inuit to Christianity. They established Godthab, now known as Nuuk, the capital of Greenland. As genetic studies and historical accounts demonstrate, men from this new wave of Danish and Norwegian settlement did mix with the local Inuit. Most Greenland Inuit are bilingual in their native languages and Danish, and around 20,000 Inuit now live in continental Denmark. In 1814, the Treaty of Kiel saw control over Greenland and other holdings formally pass from Norway to Denmark. However, Norway established a new settlement on the previously uninhabited east side of Greenland, calling it Erik the Red's land, and claiming it as new land not covered under the previous claims of sovereignty. The matter was brought and settled in the court, with the court ruling against Norway. During World War II, after Denmark was occupied by Germany, the United States occupied Greenland and created military airfields, though after the war it was returned to Denmark. However, under the auspices of NATO, the US continued to develop its military presence there. They began to construct a series of secret nuclear launch sites in the Greenland ice cap, from which they could launch a first strike nuclear attack against Russia, named Project Iceworm. Declassified documents show that their plan was eventually scrapped as unworkable at the time, but they never sought nor informed the Danish government about what they were up to. Denmark did eventually learn about this American attempt, but not until 1997. So if anyone wonders why the US under Trump wants to acquire control of Greenland, this is your answer. In 1979, Greenland was given home rule, and in 2009, they were granted self-rule, with the local Greenland government managing almost all of their own affairs, save defense and international relations. Greenlandic was made the sole official language, and it's thought that eventually Greenland may become a fully independent country. For over 1,000 years, Greenland has been a part of the Norse world, before the Inuit had set foot upon the grass of the sloping valleys. The Norse settlers had long laid claim to that land through incredible toil and blood. Though they met a grim end, they journeyed to Valhall and should be remembered for their ability to survive and even thrive in an inhospitable land. Whatever dark events might have occurred in those frozen wastes during one of the darkest and coldest periods of history should be left to lie beneath the frozen tundra, not buried with convenient lies, but accepted and left to rest as part of the often violent history of man. I hope you liked this video, and if you did, please like, share, and subscribe. Consider supporting me on Patreon, PayPal, or through YouTube Super Stickers. I can be found on Facebook or X. A big thanks to all of my supporters, and as always, stand tall.